So here we are again at this paddle project, and I've done just about all the shaping I can do with the spoke shave, and I've done a little bit of shaving or filing with these wood rasps, and they aren't doing too bad a job. Typically I will use the wood rasps up and around the handle, and what I'm going to spend most of my time at during this video is just doing some sanding, and I'm going to use the sander to dress up this portion of the paddle. It should look rather unique with the alternating cherry and maple, and it coming to this bit of a point in both cases. And so we'll see a series of these arrowhead shapes. And I've also experimented a little bit, and I should end up with one of these arrowhead shapes at both sides of the handle. So I've done one, and I've drawn a line here. So this one ended here. That means this line coming across. I've got to bring this arrowhead back up, and it should end in the same spot. I do like to try to make my paddles look a little bit symmetrical. So there's going to be a lot of sanding. If it wasn't for power tools, I probably wouldn't be in this business at all. And when it comes to power tools, sanders are probably my least favorite. They vibrate in your hands, and sometimes your hands go to sleep. But in this case, it's really pretty much the only tool that would work for a method of smoothing this down and making it look nice. And I'll also be able to get right down to a fairly, not a sharp edge, but a fairly delicate edge all along the sides. It's pretty good. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start some sanding. You'll notice I've got a piece of carpeting here. That way I can hold my paddle on an angle like this, and the end can rub on the carpeting. And I've also got another piece of carpeting on the floor if I want to do some sanding while it's standing up, just so that it doesn't bounce around on a hard surface. So I'm going to put a coarse There we go. I'll put a coarse pad on to start. You're going to probably Okay, so you'll see what I meant by those arrowhead shapes coming together, and you will also notice, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but I've pretty much maintained that pencil mark all the way down. I had to lose a little bit of it just so that I could round off that part of the arrow, but I've maintained the pencil mark, and I've brought both edges down so that both of these shapes look unique. So I'm going to do a little bit of final sanding with a finer sandpaper, but in the meantime I will finish off the other side, and that didn't take me very long. I'll bet you maybe 3 or 4 minutes at the most. I sped you up so you didn't really feel the whole time frame, but it did.
Thank you.
so that's the paddle blade sanded with the coarse sandpaper. And if you take a look at all of this portion here, both sides look fairly similar. It looks pretty nice. One of the advantages of building a paddle out of a hardwood is that you can taper the edge down so that it's really fine. If you were making a paddle out of a softwood like pine, typical to the paddles that you might buy at the Canadian Tire store or hardware store, they typically leave their edges and the whole paddle in general a little bit thicker. But it's a bit of a trade-off because it's a lighter wood, so they have to find their strength in mass, whereas this is stronger wood, and we can make them a little bit thinner. It'd probably still end up being a heavier paddle at the very end of the project, but I think it looks nicer, and that, in my opinion, speaks volumes. So I still have a lot of sanding to do on the shaft, not so much this portion here, just a matter of making it smooth and getting rid of some of the spoke shave markings. But I have a fair amount of shaping to do in the handle portion, and by the time we come back to the next video, all of the handle will be shaped down and will look nice. I'll probably spend about an hour on that handle. When you think of it, the blade is the portion of the paddle that you look at the most, so you want it to look really nice. The shaft is what you hold on to. That's where your work is done, and it should feel comfortable in your hand. But this is the most complicated portion of the paddle because your hand has to feel comfortable while holding on to that, and there's a fair amount of work to put into the handle itself. So that's where I'll probably spend most of my afternoon. So I just spent 18 minutes with this wood rasp. It's fairly coarse, and I had my paddle clamped in underneath those two pieces of carpet. There's a little bit of a V here, so I wrapped the blade or the shaft with a little piece of foam, put a piece of wood on top, and clamped it in place, and that left this really fairly rigid. So it took me 18 minutes to shave that side. It's rough, but it gives me the general shape that I'm looking for, and I'll just sand that. It won't take me long to sand it at all. So I've got another 18 minutes, I guess, to mess around on this side, and I'll try to make both sides. So that's starting to feel fairly decent. I still have to do a little bit on these inside corners because that's where my thumb, right in that area, tends to feel a sharp spot. But other than that, the shape is fairly decent and it's relatively symmetrical. So I just have to do some sanding. These little bits of cherry on either are pretty much the same size, so I'm pretty happy. I've done some sanding since my last bit of taping, and I think I have it ready to be wetted down. So I'm going to take some water and I'm just going to cover the whole thing so that I can raise the grain, and that will allow me to really get a very smooth finish on it before I put my oil and varathane on it. So I used a couple of different methods of sanding here. I have a old sanding pad, a rough one or coarse one from my palm sander, and I used it on the shaft, and I let my fingers curl around the shaft, and that allowed me to get a fairly nice contour on the shaft. And then I have some really fine, one of them is 180 on one side and this side is 240, and I continue to sand the shaft and the blade and the handle. Sometimes I use this stool for support. And so now it's ready to raise the grain.